Israel's gradually taking Ukraine's side in the war against Russia. As the Russia Ukraine war enters its second year, Israel political and military officials have watched U.S. President Joe Biden's visit to Ukraine closely and seen it as a sign of Washington's support for Kiev. Biden's visit coincided with that of Knesset members Yuli Edelstein and Zeev Elkin and that of Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen just before them. These developments may require Israel to take operational steps, especially given the growing military cooperation between Russia and Iran. Israel's belief that it was good for Cohen's visit to Ukraine to come days before Biden's arrival, or Israelis believe that it was good for Cohen's visit to Ukraine to come days before Biden's arrival. He was the first senior Israeli official to visit in any case, and there was a symbolic dimension in members of the Israeli Knesset standing with the Ukrainians alongside the U.S. president. The expectations in Israel are that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will also visit Kiev soon. Israel has been very cautious about taking sides in the war ever since it was started a year ago by the Russian invasion. Netanyahu refrained from condemning Russia, but didn't express his sympathy with the Ukrainians. However, since his return to power, he started to outline his expected policy towards the war. He said on several occasions that Israel would consider sending weapons to Ukraine and agreed to Cohen's visit. In such circumstances, he could make a solidarity trip to Ukraine without causing a crisis with Moscow. All of these visits to Kiev demonstrate that there's a visible movement by the current Israeli government in its position on the war, unlike the previous government of Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. There is thus a greater possibility that Israel will respond to Western requests for it to help Ukraine. However, the Israelis are keen not to anger Russia in case this affects the situation in Syria, Moscow's ally. The factors that could lead Israel to change its policy towards Ukraine include the occupation state's need for Western support as Iran gets closer to the nuclear threshold, even as tension between Israel and the West increases over Netanyahu's judicial coup, illegal settlements, and the danger of an explosion with the Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Jerusalem. There's also concern that it might be seen as being afraid of Russia, which would harm brand Israel around the world. Cohen's visit to Ukraine angered Moscow. This was obvious when the latter refused to postpone legal action to close down the Jewish agency in Russia. Israel fears that this marks a shift in the Russian position in response to the warming of relations between Tel Aviv and Kiev. The Jewish agency has been working on Russia for many years, encouraging migration to the occupation state and running summer camps and educational institutions. Before the call to close its office down, the Russian government demanded that it should provide special information about Jews who wished to migrate to Israel. The agency refused out of fear for their safety. Moscow's anger over Israeli support for Ukraine may prompt even more Russian alignment with Iran. During Cohen's 12-hour visit to Kiev, he met President Volodymyr Zelensky, arguably the most famous Jew in the world at the moment. And the visit had three objectives: to show that Israel supports Ukraine, just like European countries and the U.S. do, to put the Iranian issue at the forefront, and to increase Israeli humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Israelis' assessment is that Ukraine's become influential internationally, and the Israelis want it on their side against Iran, which represents a common enemy. Cohen and Zelensky discussed ways to deal with the threat of Iranian drones being used in Ukraine by Russia, and they agreed to deepen cooperation in the fight against Iran in the international arena. Although Israel promised to supply Ukraine with the Iron Dome missile defense system 6 months ago, it's not yet done so. Ukraine also asked Israel for a loan, a request to which Tel Aviv has not yet responded either way. This is rather humiliating, especially for a country at war. With this in mind, and given the near-neutral policies of the Israeli governments led by Bennett, Lapid, and Netanyahu, goodwill in Ukraine towards Israel is at an all-time low. And we can therefore only expect to see a gradual change in Israel regarding the supply of weapons to Kiev. Nevertheless, the details of Cohen's visit to Ukraine revealed the change in Israel policy towards the war, and its difference to the policy of the two previous governments. Netanyahu's current coalition government is leaning towards a position closer to the one of the warring parties without fully siding with it, which may lead to a disagreement between Tel Aviv and the other party. This visit, a full year after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, reveals new Israeli trends toward this important international issue. And from IJAC, Israel's Ukraine-Russia dilemma. The inauguration of Benjamin Netanyahu's new government has led to increased international pressure for a change in Israel's semi-neutral reserve position on the war in Ukraine. On the one hand, Washington and like-minded Western countries demand that Jerusalem go the extra mile in supporting Ukraine. On the other hand, the Kremlin expects Netanyahu, who's boasted in the past about having an extraordinarily close relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin, to preserve and deepen Russian-Israel cooperation. What considerations drive the Russian and the Israeli thinking about each other, and will Netanyahu change his country's policy towards Russia? From the Russian perspective, Israel remains, despite the Russian-Western rupture, one of the friendliest Western-oriented countries. Israel continues a high-level political dialogue with the Kremlin. It staunchly refuses to give offensive weapons to Ukraine. It hasn't imposed national economic sanctions on Russia. It hasn't abolished flights to and from Russia. And there's still a visa-free regime between the two countries, and it didn't expel Russian diplomats. Russia sees Israel as an important regional power capable of inflicting severe military and political reputational damage on Moscow. Russian President Vladimir Putin is known for his sympathy for Israel and the Jewish people, and, over the years, has invested heavily in his relationship with Netanyahu in the expectation that the latter might help bridge the gaps between Moscow and Washington. From the Israeli perspective, the war in Ukraine put potential Russian damage to Israel's national security at the forefront of the bilateral relationship and diminished the benefits to Israel from this relationship. Three main threat scenarios dominate the Israel view of Russia: that the Russians would exploit their hegemony in Syria to restrict Israeli freedom of military operations therein, that they would cooperate closely with Iran against Israel, or that Moscow would hinder the repatriation of Russian Jews to Israel. In the eyes of Jerusalem decision-makers, Russia's status as the most stubborn supporter of Iran's clerical regime among global powers is an important factor in Israel's multifaceted confrontation with Tehran. Moscow's growing use of Iranian weapons for the war in Ukraine, mainly attack drones, and export routes to Asia through Iranian territory have yet to expand into joint action between the two countries against Israeli operations in Syria. And maybe at some point we'll unpack this whole Iran drone issue, Iran supplying drones to other countries. There have been some reports on that have been pretty in-depth, and it doesn't seem to be as significant as it's being made out to be. You know, to hear something over and over and over again, it just makes it seem that severity of it is really high. But in essence, it's not. The drones themselves are made from parts that are from all over they can be found all over the world. The only part that is probably from Iran is the engine itself, and the technology itself is almost at this point an open technology because it's something that a lot of people have picked up on. So to say that Iran is providing the drones is a heavy overstatement. At the same time, the Israelis are anxious about growing security cooperation between Moscow and Tehran, including the joint venture to produce Iranian-designed drones in Russia, the sale of Russian military-grade imaging satellites to Iran, and reports that advanced Su-35 fighter jets are soon to be supplied to Tehran. Moscow pays attention to the public debate inside Israel about a possible change of course considering the Ukraine war, and uses info warfare to try to dissuade Jerusalem by raising the threat that Russia will retaliate by obstructing Israeli freedom of operations in Syria. Still, looking at the poor Russian military performance in Ukraine, many Israeli pundits question whether the small Russian military contingent in Syria is realistically capable of or willing to limit the ability of the Israeli Air Force to operate in that arena. In the past, Israel succeeded in convincing Russia to abolish some of its arms deals with Iran and restrain Iranian nuclear ambitions. Netanyahu may be hoping to do so again. Israel still thinks that the nuclearization of Iran is contrary to Russian interests, yet Jerusalem has no illusions that Moscow would be prepared to undertake any proactive diplomacy to deter Tehran from crossing dangerous red lines toward becoming a nuclear threshold state. Moscow has identified Israeli fears that it stopped Aliyah immigration to Israel of Russian Jews and initiated legal proceedings in July 2022 to terminate the activities of the Jewish Agency in Russia, the body which facilitates such immigration. Court deliberations on the decision resumed on February 17th after being postponed repeatedly since August. This might serve as yet another signal from the Kremlin to Netanyahu to refrain from drifting further away from Moscow, although the prolongation of the procedure implies that the threat of shutdown serves the Kremlin's interest better than the actual closure of the Jewish agency's offices would. While Israel has not imposed national sanctions on Russia and indeed lacks a legislation framework for doing so, the scope of economic cooperation between the countries has dwindled, as Israel has acted vigorously to find substitutes for importing Russian oils and grains. The memory of the Holocaust, which provided the seemingly uncontroversial basis for relations due to Israel's gratitude over the Red Army's liberation of the main Nazi concentration camps in World War II, became toxic after Moscow branded Ukraine, led by the Jewish President Volodymyr Zelensky, a Nazi regime. Moreover, Israelis cannot accept the increased usage by the Russian propaganda machine of anti-Semitic narrative. This article, I may not read the rest of this article because I was thinking just before this paragraph that this is implying bias, but at this point it's gone past implying, right? So Jews can't be Nazis. First thing. That's wrong. Jews can be Nazis. The connection between the two is not, there are German Jews that were Nazis. And not only that, there are people who are abused by Nazis and subjugated by Nazis who revere them and want to be like them. And so they act out in ways not unlike Stanislav, Galicia, and historical Ukraine. The crucial predicament for Israel comes from Western demands to do more Ukraine, especially in the military realm. The Israeli National Security Council is reportedly conducting an examination of Israel's policies on the issue. Okay, so let's move on. And here we have Israel condemns Russian aggression but has a unique stance, head of Israel Foreign Ministry. Eli Cohen, Israel Foreign Minister, said that Israel condemns Russian aggression but notes the unique position of Jerusalem. Cohen said that, of course, we condemn the Russian aggression, but noted Jerusalem's unique position.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
We are not like your country, meaning Germany. Russia is a pivot player in our region. Cohen also recalled his recent visit to Kiev. It was the first visit of a high-ranking Israel official to Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion. Israel Foreign Minister Eli Cohen has met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev and promised to supply Ukraine with a civilian air defense system. During his visit to Ukraine, Cohen said that Israel intends to support the peace formula proposed by President Volodymyr Zelensky. During his meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron on Thursday, Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, announced that he's ready to send military things to Ukraine. And the friction between Israel and Russia following the war in Ukraine. Israel has ties with Russia, yet there is tension. There's a possibility that this is biased as well, so see if we get through it. Israel has ties with Russia, yet there's tension between them following the war in Ukraine, mostly because of Iran. Russia receives from Iran military aid such as drones, which assist Russia's air war effort. In return, Russia provides unprecedented level of military aid to Iran. Russia's assistance to Iran, including in other issues such as regarding Syria and Iran's nuclear program, caused friction between Israel and Russia, and in the worst case, it could bring a clash between their militaries. Iran and the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine puts Israel in a tough spot. Israel does not want to aggravate Russia because of several interests, including protecting the Jews who live in Russia who might be at risk if Israel supports Ukraine. On the other hand, Israel certainly does not associate itself in any way as a Russian partner in the war in Ukraine. Israel even gave some civilian aid to Ukraine. Russia warned Israel not to provide weapons to Ukraine, yet Israel might do it in coordination with the United States. Such an Israel move depends, among others, on how Russia cooperates with Iran. Iran sold Russia drones that attacked Ukrainian cities. Iran and Russia also plan to build drones together. Ukrainian air defense might not be able to shoot down Iranian ballistic missiles if they're delivered to Russia. Iran's military aid to Russia concerned Israel because Iran would learn from the war in Ukraine how to improve its drones and missiles. Later on, Iran can use them against. This is a lot of speculation, once again. Let's see. And the entire article is pretty much about Iran's nuclear program, which is very interesting. And this is from realcleardefense.com. I mean, we know what they're about. They sell weapons for sure, or have something to do with the military-industrial complex. Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets and missiles covering Israel. In the next war, Israel might be hit daily by up to 2,000 rockets and missiles. Furthermore, Israel is concerned about Hezbollah's effort, which receives strong Iranian support, aimed at improving the accuracy of some of its missiles, which would allow Hezbollah to pinpoint targets in Israel. And it could severely damage Israel's civilian and military infrastructure. Therefore, Israel is eager to slow down this Hezbollah project by bombing inside Syria. If Russia, as a favor to Iran following Iranian aid in Ukraine, tries to restrain Israel's operation in Syria, it would assist Hezbollah in upgrading its missiles. This is another factor that could increase the friction between Israel and Russia. Interesting. Okay, watch this space.
Watch this space.
And we shall return with more news in just